Welcome to the Talent Tide podcast, presented by Job.com. This is the show that ensures you have the information you need to adapt and evolve your workplace culture as you ride the wave of change in talent management. I'm your host, Chris Nichols, and today we have a special guest, a friend and former colleague, and Steve O'Brien. Steve is the Senior Vice President of Talent Acquisition at Syneos Health, a $5 billion global biopharmaceutical solutions organization. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. How are you today?
Thanks, Chris. I'm doing great.
I'm glad to have you. I want to cover a lot today, but why don't you take us through a journey of how you got to be the SVP of Talent Acquisition at such a cool company like Syneos? Where did you start and how did you get here?
Where did I start? The key is to be really handsome. If you guys are watching the video podcast, it'll all make sense. I got into recruiting like a lot of us, accidentally. I often quickly object that I stayed on purpose. I had done an undergraduate degree in a liberal arts field, but not just any liberal arts field, one of the more obscure, philosophy, and was left after I graduated with a bit of a problem to solve. The original plan was to go to law school. I had gone so far as to apply and enroll, and met a woman around that same time that didn't want to be a law school girlfriend or involved in a long distance relationship. And as the wisest of plans to abandon at 22 everything I'd prepared for, I certainly took that option. Now she's my wife and the mother of my children, so it worked out. But it did leave me with a problem to solve, and that was that I had an undergraduate degree in philosophy. Recruiting was one of those careers that it didn't really matter what you studied. It sort of mattered if you were willing to do the work and be compensated basically based on your production. That was a bargain I was willing to take, and I got into technical recruiting and quickly fell in love with it. I enjoyed the competitiveness of it. I enjoyed the analytical nature of trying to find an individual that matched a set of requirements. But the glue that ultimately sealed the deal for me to stay was the unique way that we get to intersect with people's lives. My first candidate that I placed was a guy named Sridhar. I took him out to lunch, and if you guys are familiar with technical recruiting, you take them out to lunch, not for charity, but to push them for leads and to figure out if they can introduce you to more managers in the company, right? I don't feel bad about it, but it was obviously quite self-serving. And his wife and child came along to lunch, and his wife made a comment that I had made a big difference for them. That contrast between my motives and their experience opened my eyes to the unique opportunity we have as recruiters to impact people in special times in their lives. And that was really a potent brew, so to speak. And I chose not to ever put it down. Throughout the last 20 years, I've been in the supplier side for most of my career. Spent about 10 years within recruitment process outsourcing and began to learn the joy of building large systems that produce great outcomes and ideally also give recruiters really great careers and hiring managers and candidates really great solutions to their problems, which led to where I am now. While I was at IBM, I led the life sciences portfolio for business process outsourcing, and one of my clients was a clinical research organization. It's a space where not much comes easily. When you make TA work in clinical research, you did it on purpose, and I enjoy that challenge. And also the recruiters that succeed in this space often are quite gifted at working through many different modes of talent acquisition, strong with managing candidate experience, strong with problem solving, strong with sourcing, and that complexity was attractive. And so when the opportunity to join Syneos came up, I said, let's talk.
I don't want to go off script from the very beginning based upon what we've already talked about, but man, the powerful moment that must have been for you at lunch with that presumably young to young-ish family, and to hear from them how important of a life change this was for them is something that I think we forget about all the time in talent acquisition and recruiting, and honestly in business, right? Like when we're employing people, we're not just employing the human themselves, we're employing their livelihood, whether that's their family or, their goals, et cetera. And so I think that's such a missed connection point in talent acquisition in general. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'll say for myself, I'm quite idealistic. The charm of that intersection between navigating macroeconomic trends and large patterns and making enormous systems of recruiters and hundreds of thousands of applicants work at scale, while simultaneously remembering that each of those 100,000 applicants is a human, a neighbor, a father, mother, spouse, child, son, daughter, like that contrast between large systems and each member of the large system being a person that you in some way intersect with in a meaningful fashion is extremely attractive, and it's sort of a constant tension, right? uh, I will from time to time say to folks that work closely with me that one of the practices that is valuable within designing TA systems is to, on one hand, and think of like these two hands as like graph paper or trace paper that you used when you were in school. You design out a solution that is only concerned with efficiency and sort of Six Sigma type stuff, don't really consider the human at all. And then on the other hand, design throwing Six Sigma out and asking what is it going to feel like to work in the system, right? Design for the human. And then slide the two graph papers over, and it's almost like the solution emerges, right? Like, in order to be great at TA, we need to both design systems that work at scale and systems that work at scale for the individual. And it's not going to be the perfectly austere Six Sigma often, but it's also not going to be able to be the clumsy white glove. Everybody gets, a 45-minute post interview debrief after every interview that they have when you're doing 12,000 hires a year, right? So slide those two papers over, and then the solution sort of pops out.
I think every company's definition of what it means to be great at recruiting is different because of
Actually,
that reason that you just explained, right? Like, we all have different priorities. Every company has different priorities for what their expectations are in TA and recruiting and HR and employee experience. And I think the companies that are usually best at all of those things are typically honest about that up front. Like, this is who we are and this is who we're going to be. And I think it sets the right expectation. So I'm glad we got off on that tangent to begin with. We've never gotten off on tangents before in conversations.
no, never. Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot to that when you're designing TA. Is one, realizing that to some degree we suffer from an oversimplification by virtue of the fact that we refer to talent acquisition as talent acquisition. Right. And my awful analogy that you've probably heard me use before is that there's a similarity between the misleading simplicity of the word talent acquisition and the misleading simplicity of dinner. Right. Dinner represents something. It's a meal after lunch. It's before you go to bed. It's often, the biggest meal of the day. But for some people, it never includes meat. Right. For some people, it always includes a salad. There's all of these variations culturally and in terms of cuisine, spices, construction. And so, yeah, it represents something, but there's an enormous amount of diversity underneath of that word as well. Talent acquisition has a similar phenomenon. It does mean something, but the way that you run talent acquisition has an extraordinary amount of diversity baked in to it. And so asking the question, what do we intend to deliver? What is our commitment to the candidate base, to the hiring managers, to the business, to the employee population that could be internal applicants? Those answers help you begin to determine what format, structure, and value do you plan to provide. And then the other thing that you've got to consider is, what's your source channel makeup, right? So for a company that hires 85% of its candidates as applicants, meaning that they've, without a recruiter persuading them, on their own decided to fill out an application and raise their hand for interest, versus a company that hires 85% sourced candidates, they're entirely different processes. And the way that you structure that organization is entirely different.
Absolutely. You always have the best analogy, Steve. I appreciate the constructive way in which you can paint a picture. Getting back on topic a hair based upon your introduction. So you talked about getting into technical recruiting. Now you're developing and improving talent acquisition processes at a large organization. What do you think are the biggest changes that you've seen since you began your career in this space? Because a lot of it remains the same. A lot of things are very similar to the way that it was 20 years ago, as far as the sourcing, screening, et cetera. So what do you see as being the biggest changes that you've experienced?
Well, there's one that's come up recently that I find fascinating. As we've moved into the post-COVID world and experienced meaningful inflation in lots of aspects of our consumer life, there's emerged a belief amongst candidates that they need to swing for the fences, and I don't begrudge them that, right? However, in a context where every candidate is showing up willing to ask for the world, your recruiters need to be better negotiators now than they used to be, right? And so if I go back 15 years ago, and I'm not longing for these days, I'm contrasting, right? You would just ask a candidate, what are you making now? And then you would apply 10%. and you would basically say, all right, if you're making 80, we'll offer you 88.5 and a 5K sign on or something like that, right? Like negotiation and salary for the majority of our careers and our roles was almost derivative, right? It's sort of derivative of what you're at now, plus some markup, so to speak, that the recruiter knows that they can close you within, and then that becomes the job offer. Well, not only are we not in most states able to ask what you're making now, and I understand why and have a lot of sympathy for that, but not only that, in addition, candidates show up ready to ask for the world because there's a zeitgeist, right? There's just a cultural move to swing for the fences. And so not that I want to minimize the amount of income that somebody makes in a job change, but that can get out of hand, right? You might have somebody that is making 120 right now, and they say that they're looking for 180, right? Well, if we don't have a way to negotiate and navigate that conversation, you could end up turning that candidate down, right? Like you could move on, and then the candidate's annoyed because they didn't get a call back or they didn't move forward. They're not sure why. Or you don't properly manage the candidate's expectations. You do move them forward. You're ready to make an offer for 150, but because you never really grappled with that 180, now making the job offer feels like a negative, right? Like this is 30K less than what I told you I was looking for. It's important to be able to negotiate in far more sophisticated ways in order to, one, make sure that you don't miss candidates, two, exercise your responsibility as a recruiter guarding the finances of the organization, right? You can't give away the farm with every single role. And three, to not bring people into the company with a negative compensation experience, right? We've heard this cliche before, or perhaps not. It's one that I think about though. Compensation is a terrible motivator, but it's a phenomenal demotivator, right? And the recruiter's at the tip of that spear, bringing people in, brokering those deals, and setting expectations, and hopefully bringing people in feeling recognized, rewarded, and wanted, as opposed to feeling sort of manhandled or unheard.
Love that example.
So
That
that's a
is a
big
big
change.
change, and it is one that continues to have a tipping point here. It is September 12th, 2022, as we record, and there has been some talk in some of the spaces, whether you're on LinkedIn, about it beginning to tip back towards the employer at this point. I just saw something over the weekend, I think, around current employees are maybe a bit more resistant to be asking for raises right now, just with the current economic situation in the country and things that are going on. So how are you talking with your recruiters on how to balance these conversations, Steve? Right, because you're trying to match skill sets up with the job descriptions and the talent that you're trying to find, but then understanding the massive shift in compensation over the last really 24 months. How are you helping to assist your team in developing these conversations more effectively?
Yeah. So there's three questions, and one of the realities with getting training to be effective at scale is making it simple is important, right? If the way that we want to instruct our recruiters to negotiate is complex or requires, a master's degree in hostage negotiation, then it may be a really effective model, but it probably won't lead to a lot of learning outcomes. you may not see it in the wild much. And so there's a couple questions that I offer to the recruiters to ask that help facilitate the dialogue and to help the dialogue be so healthy is the word that's coming to mind. There's probably something baked in there I don't quite mean. I don't mean to imply that not doing it this way is unhealthy, but I hope that the recruiters on my team are able to negotiate without it feeling hostile. Because again, I'm very sensitive to the idea that compensation's a really great demotivator. And we don't want people joining our company or any talent acquisition function. You don't want people accepting your offers with regrets, right? That said, one question that I teach the recruiters to ask when a candidate comes in with a number is just to say, hey, that's a big number. Can you tell me about it? Right. So as you ask a candidate what they're looking for, if you know that your range is 120 to 140 and they come at 180, don't over rotate. Right. Like, don't try and like go for the jugular or negotiate them down. Like, just ask an honest, like, empathy question in a sense, like, where are you coming from? Right. Tell me about that number. And sometimes it's as simple as, well, my buddy just left and that's what he got. Right. Or I don't know, it's what I'm shooting for, but all of these are conversation starters, and they lead you into a dialogue with a candidate that isn't adversarial and doesn't have or hopefully minimizes the amount of power dynamic. Right. It's just, honestly, I want to know where you're coming from. You asked for 180. Tell me about that number. A second question that is a bit more oriented towards trying to establish a range with the candidate or understand more about where they would accept or reject. If it's true, is to share with them, would it surprise you that that's higher than most of our associates in that role get paid today? It's an honest, simple comment that helps, again, bring the conversation forward and begin to establish some numerical sort of marking points as you get ready to negotiate. So we know that internal equity often trails behind where you are hiring at. So the point is not to say that because that's more than our other associates are making, that therefore I'm not going to make the offer, but I want to help ground, right, our conversation, and also make sure that you know that it's not me versus you. That's more than our other associates are making. Is that a surprise? Gives the candidate the opportunity to say no, right? When you're negotiating, yeses are a bit of a cheap trick. No is a way to give safety to the person that you're negotiating with and to make sure that they feel like they have a standing in the conversation. And then the third question that I teach them to ask is, at what point should I not call you back? Right? If it's the right job and the right hiring manager and they're going to offer 135, should I call you back? Right? And if the answer is no, like, great, that helps a lot. When should I not call you back? Right? And they might say 145. So now you've got a lot of information, and hopefully if you do it well, it hasn't felt like you were steamrolled if you're the candidate, because the goal is not to steamroll the candidate. It's just to do some of the upfront work to figure out, like, where are you at actually? Where do you need to be? I want to give you some context on where the other associates are in our company today, and I don't want to waste your time, right? My intention is not to insult you as a recruiter. And if 135 is insulting or it's not on the table, just tell me. That's okay. I don't want to call you back at 135. These are tactics, so to speak, that if you had asked 15 years ago, does every recruiter need to be doing this with their candidates? I said, no. Ask them where they're at, right? But that's not the world that we live in now. And also, candidates are shooting for the moon. And God bless them for it, right? But it does change the dynamic for the recruiter to be able to fulfill their responsibility on behalf of their employer, right, to make good job offers and to protect the company against sort of runaway compensation, which does unfortunately sink the organization if it's sort of scaled out, right? If you just allow every person to pick their price and offer no sort of financial stewardship from the recruiting chair, that's a problem.
I think I would start with the third question first. That's a pretty good one. I like that. Where?
When should I? When should I
Yeah,
not
I
call you
like it a
back?
lot. The process is so confrontational as it is, right? Like when you're negotiating and you're having conversations, typically that's not where the conversation started at, right? You started on the basis of, would this job be right for you? And you hear the job as a candidate, and you think, yeah, that is something that I'd be interested in. But your expectation in your mind might be that it pays this, when in reality it pays that. And it's amazing how much expectations play into the role of our happiness, right? Because in some scenarios, I might have been perfectly happy with 150. In another scenario, I might be very upset with 150 based upon the initial conversation and expectations that were set for what what a job would be like. I've never been in that situation
Yeah.
myself, but just throwing it out there.
Yeah. Well, we including me, we lean very hard as people into the idea of
Yeah.
fair, and uh, as compensation becomes a more common pop culture talking point and more prevalent in LinkedIn posts, you see some big numbers out there. They may be true, they may be not, they may be aspirational, they may be stirring the pot, who knows? But they begin to pluck at our strings of fairness that live in our minds. And again, I include myself with this. This is not a psychologization of others. And there's an interesting study that I'll aggressively summarize here that just sort of illustrates, and we may be able to relate to in terms of fairness. So there was a study set up to try and test how or at what point would we draw the lines in fairness, and the line being, I don't want to play this game. I don't want to participate in this thing any longer. And so they set up a carnival game at a fair that had 100 cups, and underneath of one of the 100 cups was $100 bill. In order to play the game, you paid $1 and you got to pick a cup, right? So mathematically, if the payoff is 100 to 1, there's 1 in 100 chance and it costs 1/100th to play. That's a decent game. You know what I mean? Like if my son went up to that and he's like, hey, can I have $5? Like, yeah, that's a fair game. You're not being exploited, right? And so there was a nice long line and lots of people wanted to play this carnival game. The next night, they set the game up differently. It was still structurally the same from a format, 100 cups underneath of one of the cups was $100 bill, but now there were two players, not one. One player paid $1 and got a cup. The other player, the second player, paid $1 and got the other 99. Now, the first player's odds were the same. It was still a fair game, quote unquote, mathematically for the first player. But to no surprise to any of us, nobody wanted to play that game because it's not fair. The odds for the other person are extraordinarily stacked in their favor. My experience with the game, personally, is the same, but the context of the game has changed. And because the context isn't fair, people didn't line up to play.
Both had the chance to win $100, but their odds were unequal, right? And I think that's where the conversation around fairness and equality comes into play quite often. And we assume that one is the same as the other, and the reality is they are not. So I would love to keep talking about compensation, but there's a lot more that I want to get into with you, Steve. We only have a limited amount of time. We could probably spend our entire afternoon here, and so you've been an agency recruiter.
This is why Chris and I couldn't be colleagues. Is we would just
too much pontification. Absolutely. So
that's right.
You've been in agency recruiting. You've been in RPO. You have been in the technology space, services, etc., and now you are in-house. I would like to talk to you a little bit more now about like the future. Like, how does this get better? How do we improve recruiting? Because, like we just said, not much has changed over the last 20 years. Negotiating has played a bigger role. That may start to trickle down a little bit as far as the role that it plays within the process. But how do we get better at recruiting? What does the future look like, Steve?
Well, it's a good question. Maybe I'll wade into it just by starting to make observations about where things have improved and not improved. So if you go back 15 years, technology wasn't quote unquote as good, but the operating environment was more simple, right? 15 years ago, you might have used a monster job board and your ATS if you had an ATS. You had fewer systems, and to get a candidate's phone number, you didn't have to go through some strange messaging protocol like LinkedIn Recruiter, right? Now, where we are today, we quote unquote have better technology, but the operating environment is far more complex. Like my recruiters use an ATS, a CRM, a mismatch of job boards. We might use our CRM's messaging capabilities. We might use a different drip marketing solution. We've got text recruiting capabilities that you load into Text Recruit. you've got an ATS. The number of systems that we work in now is significant, right? So they're all cool and they all do great stuff, but the experience of a recruiter is, well, now my operating environment is extremely fragmented. So I think one of the things that we've got to do, and this is not particularly insightful, I think the industry's been saying this for a while, we want to think about user experience and designing for the recruiter and actively squeezing out complexity in the operating environment because it does lead to inefficiencies. I think the other thing that we want to invest in, even to the point of perhaps putting together teams that do this work, is get your recruiters out of LinkedIn Recruiter as the only messaging protocol they use. I think I love LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn Recruiter, but it can be a poison to creativity. And if you're on the receiving end of LinkedIn Recruiter messages, they show up as an in-mail. If you're recruiting a candidate, asking them, do you want to buy, is not the first question that you ask somebody, right? But when the message shows up as an in-mail, if you're a passive candidate, basically it's opening the conversation with you essentially as, do you want a job change? Right. And so not only have we given the recruiters a foreign messaging protocol, right, through this website as opposed to text message or phone calls, but we've also put the recipients of the message in a position where maybe I would be open to a job change, but I don't want to start with telling you that I'm interested in a job change. Right. Like I'm just not there mentally. I don't have an updated resume. I'd like to talk a little bit more about what you see's in it for me and for you to learn a little bit more about what I'm looking for before we go and take that step of, yeah, I'm looking for a job change.
So what I heard from you then is centralization of our systems, right? Because we went from a process that was actually very easy and straightforward to one that is now a very complex web of environments. And we've created a negative experience because of that for both the recruiter and the candidate. We're also seeing a lot of layoffs again in the recruitment space because we only value recruiting when we need it, and we get rid of it as soon as the first opportunity presents itself to move away from it. How do we create an experience that is both good for the candidate and good for the recruiter? Because we often see our recruiters as we hire them, and I say we meaning businesses, not necessarily you or I or any leader of TA, as transactional, right? Because we look at them and say, well, we just need a butt in the seat to help us fill more butts in the seat. How do we create a more experiential environment that improves the entire system, Steve?
Well, it's a really tough question, and we even see this. So I'm going to wander off into hopefully territory that doesn't get me in trouble. But there's another market segment where we see significantly different behaviors of different quote unquote user types. So dating apps, right? And so when you look at dating apps like Tinder, they've simplified sort of the matchmaking component of swipe left, swipe right. But the participants in the dating apps have different levels of selectivity. And so when you look at the metadata for dating apps, you see patterns. Any pattern is going to miss the individual, right? Let me say that first. I know that the rule does not define the individual, but at the metadata level, you see that men are less selective and women are more selective, right? And so you see a decrease of selection at the swipe level for men and an increase of selectivity for the swipe level for a female. Now, you've got other products that are trying to control for this, like Bumble, and others that are trying to add more science. My point is not that one is better than the other, but you see these patterns as you make it simpler to select. The metadata reveals that not all participants behave the same, right? So we make it easier for applicants to apply, right? But then you have recruiters become quote unquote more selective because they're getting flooded with all of these expressions of interest. And so one of the problems is, how do we add more data or insight into where I should apply and information about the applicants so that we help balance the difference in selectivity. Does that make sense, right? To get away from applicants just spamming applications, because we see that right now. I mean, we get probably 400,000 applications, and a lot of the applicants, if there's multiple roles to apply to, if they're in a low selectivity mode, right, they're an active applicant, they're just shooting in tons of applications. But that creates a lot of noise in the system, which increases the recruiter's selectivity. The likelihood that they're going to engage with that source channel decreases because there's so much content, there's so much noise in that channel. So one thing that we've got to do is balance the signal to noise ratio at an applicant level, right? An idea, and I know that you guys at Job.com are working on this, that I still think has both some romance but also some value to it, is helping those that are not necessarily active applicants communicate what kinds of jobs would I be willing to apply for. And then when jobs meet those criteria, to actually raise that to you as a role that you should consider, right? So Amazon does this with its shopping algorithms. So the idea that I'm shopping for a golf club is not descriptive of lots of golfers, right? More likely, a golfer that is willing to buy a golf club is shopping for a golf club if it meets a whole bunch of different conditionals, right? And so I don't want Amazon to send me every golf club that is for sale. I want Amazon to send me golf clubs that are for sale that meet certain criteria, right? If Amazon's algorithm was just to ship me all of the golf clubs that are for sale, I would disengage with that, right? But if they can increase the match, if they can increase the accuracy between what I'm being asked to pay attention to and what I'm actually looking for, they get more of a balance between buyer and seller.
And we have an imbalance on both sides, because as you're saying,
so this is one thing that we got to work
because
on.
As you're saying that you get 400,000, inbound applications every year, I'm sitting here thinking on my end, I wonder how many outbound communications your recruiters also send a year that they get no response from, by the way, right? Because
it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands.
Right. So we have all of this terrible communication that's both inbound and outbound, and we're creating so much noise in the system that it just the ineffectiveness of it all is astronomical, and it's hard to think about another system that is as broken as this particular system in any organization. Would you agree with that, Steve?
Job.com is a HR technology company dedicated to providing the best digital recruitment platform and talent solutions on the market. Our mission at Job is to remove the friction from the hiring process by delivering technology that creates more effective talent placement, better fit career moves, and a more human hiring process.
So when we look at trying to introduce some improvements in balance between the buyer and the seller, because you're right, there is an extraordinary amount of inefficiency. We probably send out 800,000 outbound messages at a minimum. So now we're at 1.2 million quote unquote intersections with the market, and we're making about 12,000 hires a year in my groups. And so that hit rate of messaging is just painfully low. So if you go back to the 400,000 applicants, a certain percentage of them are just going to be flipping applications. But a bigger percentage of them are just not quite ready yet. And so in clinical research, to be qualified for a role is relatively precise in the sense that if we're looking for 2 years of data management experience and you've got one, you're not qualified, right? However, when we get those applicants that have a year of data management experience, if they haven't changed career paths, you know what they have next year? 2 years experience.
Look at that.
And so how do we actively manage the data of the historical applicants to add value and insight into the information that we have so that we can be a bit more like Amazon and reach back out, as opposed to in large aggregates or in sort of the brute force of buyer seller, instead reaching out with a bit of insight injected into the communication and the data that we're managing, so that we can say in a year, hey, you've changed and we've changed. Our records show that you probably have 2 years data management experience. We'd love to talk, right? That's a delightful experience, especially if you applied a year ago, weren't selected, really haven't thought much about Syneos in about a year, but to see us add value and insight to the data that we've received from you, and then to proactively reach out, not only is that more accurate, but it's delightful.
So centralize the system. So we think about that from a messaging perspective and how we just get better and more effective. I think that's a huge opportunity that somebody has to solve, right? Whether it's a tech company, hopefully it's a recruiting company that has an understanding of or at least a partner that they can go find in a tech company, because much like healthcare, coming as an outsider into the industry and trying to fix things is not always the easiest solution to the problem. And so we talk about centralization. What about the process itself? How do you see the process of the recruitment process changing from maybe the more traditional pieces of recruiting that you've seen in the past?
Well, I think an interesting question for us to wrestle with if you do phone screens is why do you do them? I understand that could come across as controversial, and I'm not even necessarily advocating for getting rid of phone screens. But if one of the questions that you ask about a process step is how often does it change the future, uh, I'm not sure the phone screen would score really high, right? Now, every company's different. Again, if you have really great uptake from your hiring managers with reviewing phone screens and having that influence their selection decisions, cool. But for a lot of organizations, the recruiter spends, probably 15 minutes scheduling an interview or a phone screen, rather, 30 minutes conducting the phone screen, and then 15 minutes cleaning the notes up and submitting them. So you've got an hour of time. If your recruiter is making $100,000 a year, you spent $50 on that phone screen, and you're probably doing them at mass. How often does that phone screen really change a hiring manager's behavior? Or how often does that phone screen honestly really get looked at? Right? Many hiring managers click into the resume, do the same thing that we do as recruiters, which is make about a 10-second gut judgment, and then decide that they're going to interview the person or not interview the person. What value did the phone screen bring? And again, I want to be cautious here. I'm not suggesting that they're valueless or that we can't find a defense for them, but it's an interesting question because an extraordinary amount of time and cost goes into the phone screen.
I'm glad you said it. It's something that you and I have talked about a lot. We have very similar opinions on this particular subject. And I would take it a step further and say, you probably should be evaluating each step of the recruitment process with a little bit more of a fine-tooth comb than you do at this point, because there are many parts of the process itself that are not great. Whether it's the handoff to the hiring manager, the hand back from a hiring manager to onboarding, you want to improve your team and your efficiency. You can probably start right there with some very simple process and procedural changes within the recruitment process. Is there anything else that you would say related to that topic, Steve?
So, well, I want to expand a little bit more on the idea of getting rid of the phone screen. So for the listener, one of the sort of the resolves, in my humble opinion, is when you're working in a role where advocating for your candidate is part of succeeding as a recruiter, the phone screen is probably important. And counterintuitively, the phone screen is less about informing the hiring manager and more about informing yourself on how to advocate for your candidate. However, if you're working in a skill set area where you're not really advocating, right, that's just not part of the recipe that leads to success or closing that requisition, I think getting rid of the phone screen is something that is worth really thinking hard about. And part of coming to this aha begins with being willing to question the sacred cow, so to speak, that everybody gets a phone screen. We have a role category right now at Syneos that we're exploring getting rid of the phone screen for, and some of the theses components are that for this role, the candidate would probably rather talk to a hiring manager right away than a recruiter, right? In addition, the hiring manager is really just going to go into the resume and not look at the phone screen. It's not a complex enough role that these complexities of a phone screen and an interview are going to affect their decision. And then finally, in some role categories, if you advocating for the candidate doesn't really have the weight and the ability to change the hiring manager's decision, you sort of zeroed out the value of the phone screen. And arguably, you're improving the process, you're improving the candidate experience, you're improving the hiring manager experience and the speed of the process by saying, you know what, I'm not sure I can really give a compelling defense of the phone screen here. That said, there are other roles where advocating for candidates, as we all know, is a essential part of getting that role filled, as well as really understanding the quality and caliber of the person that you're looking at. And so in those categories, the phone screen's relevant, but not for the most traditional reasons, in my opinion, not because we're going to add detail to the resume and going to help the hiring manager make a more wide-eyed assessment, but because instead it equips you as the recruiter to be able to advocate for that candidate and defend the intangible or not as evident strengths and capabilities they're bringing that aren't going to pop off the resume.
For sure. Steve, this has been a great conversation. We're up against time. If you're interested in hearing more of a conversation between Steve and I, we actually have an episode on YouTube called Your Strategy Sucks. You can put that into YouTube's search engine and go find us. We'll also put the note in the show notes as well for the URL. But it was a good session that Steve and I did last November, and it was enlightening. I think the conversation there is really valuable. Unfortunately, I'm going to be doing that same presentation this week by myself, so it won't be nearly as good. But do check it out on YouTube. Steve, if somebody wanted to reach out to you and find you someplace, what's the best way for them to find you online?
Shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Send me a connection request and shoot me a message.
A custom message, and don't ask him if he wants a job.
Yeah, I prefer it not being in mail because it'll probably get deleted right away.
Same. If I get one more message about becoming a franchise owner, I'm probably just going to deactivate my LinkedIn account at this point. Hey, Steve.
Yeah. I've gotten very interested in the options I have to bring gelato to Raleigh.
As if it probably doesn't already exist there. Steve, thanks again for joining the Talent Tide podcast. Looking forward to sharing this with people. And remember, success is on the other side of fear, folks. So if you're looking to improve, seek out individuals like Steve O'Brien. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions. And we'll see you next time on the Talent Tide. Thank you.